I'm really glad to be here with you all tonight. Judge Baker, I don't know if has anyone here ever heard of Judge Baker? A few folks. So we're located in Boston in the Longwood medical area, sort of up on Mission Hill, right next to New England Baptist Hospital, if you know where that is. And we've actually been around for 100 years. So we're one of the very oldest children's mental health institutions in Massachusetts. And one of the first questions I usually get is, well, why are you called Judge Baker? We're named after Judge Harvey Baker, who was the first juvenile court judge in Boston. He was actually the second in the country. The first was out in Chicago. And he was a very interesting guy. He was assigned to create this juvenile court in Boston, and he saw all of these primarily young adolescent boys coming through his court who were labeled as delinquents. And he saw these kids coming through, and he said, you know what? These kids aren't delinquents. They really just need help. They're people who, we've sort of are struggling, and we need to figure out how to get them some services and supports. And he did a lot of work as a judge to try and help that community of children in Boston. And when he died, they created a foundation and established the Judge Baker Children's Center. So that's why we have that unique name. We've actually are affiliated with Harvard Medical School, and we are the child psychiatry leg of Harvard Medical School. For many years served as the child psychiatry division of Children's Hospital. So we offer a whole wide range of services, outpatient services. We have a special education school called Manville, and we do a lot of outreach like we are tonight. So we're really happy to be here. On our panel tonight, we have down at the far end, we actually have Sarah Tannenbaum. Sarah is a psychologist. She is the associate director of our Camp Baker. And I do want to tell you a word or two about Camp Baker. We have offered that camp in the summer at Judge Baker for kids with ADHD that just really can't make it in a regular mainstream camp. But the really exciting news is this summer we are coming to Hale Reservation. So we're actually going to be offering our Camp Baker for kids with ADHD right here in Westwood. And so if any of you are interested in that or have kids with ADHD, definitely reach out to Sarah after the presentation tonight. Sarah also is a psychologist that works in our Center for Effective Child Therapy. We have an outpatient center that only offers evidence-based treatments for kids with anxiety, depression, trauma, and conduct problems. And she's very knowledgeable about a whole range of topics. And then we also have Danielle Sutton, who I've known, I think, about 10 minutes now. I feel like we go way back. And Danielle is the director at Westwood Youth and Family Services. Mm-hmm. She's a licensed clinical social worker. And she's been working in that role since 2004, That's so right. For some time. And then our ghost panelist is Dr. Todd Danforth, who I've actually known for over 25 years because Todd and I went to graduate school together. I think he might be punking me right now, so I think that might be why he hasn't arrived. But Todd is actually a school psychologist in the Westwood Public Schools and has a really wide range of experience working as a school psychologist, neuropsychologist, and public service provider here in Westwood. And he's a very knowledgeable guy as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to turn it over. Who's going first?
So I would be second in the lineup, so I'm going to move forward into my section of slides, and then Great. We'll just go from there.
Okay.
This is like a whetting your appetite. Whoa.
Whoa, what happened?
Oh, Steve, already. I'm needing your help.
That's all right. Let's see. Yes, I could get it. Is it better?
Okay, I'm going to go slower this time.
All
Hello.
Right. Oh,
no,
there he is.
Would you like me to go first, Todd?
A bit of a domestic crisis
All right. Welcome.
involving a dog and an Oriental rug.
More on that later.
I'll fill you in later.
Todd, are you ready to hit the ground running?
I am.
All right.
All right. We just did introductions. If you want to get going, Todd, I have the clicker right here. You can mic up.
Wow. I already told them that we've known each other for over 25 years, Todd, so. And I said that you might be punking me by not showing up.
That's right.
There have been issues in the past. All right, now,
if you're going to move over there, I'm going to give you some more rope.
And you need to use this mic as well as that mic because they do two different things.
And this is forward, right?
Yep,
Great. Oh,
the one on the right-hand side.
oh.
There you go.
All right. So this is a Common Sense Media report that was put out about, I think, 3 years ago. There's a Kaiser Family Foundation report too that basically says pretty much the same thing. I work by myself a lot, so I don't used to this. In terms of looking at what seems like an amazing amount of time that teenagers are involved in screen use, 9 hours of entertainment media per day. And then I think more concerning are tweens, and we'll talk about why that is. Kids between 8 and 11 to 12, and their utilization. And there's some important neurodevelopmental reasons why that raises concerns for people in terms of some of the things that are going on at that point in time in kids' brains, particularly when they're sleeping. And sleep disturbance is a real issue when it comes to looking at all sorts of digital media, whether we're talking about e-readers, we're talking about phones, we're talking about playing video games, things like that. There are real differences, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Even something as innocuous as an e-reader versus a regular book, there are several studies that show melatonin secretion, for example, is disrupted in both adults and in kids. And melatonin secretion is really important in terms of circadian rhythms and stuff. So, okay, the key components they identify: duration, how long you're using it. It makes sense, right? Content, what you're looking at. Now, it's sort of obvious, but if you're looking at content that's very active, there's gaming type stuff, it's exciting the brain, okay? It's different than just watching a movie or something like that. And after dark use is really the thing that when you talk to kids, particularly kids anywhere between 8th grade and 10th and 11th, that's what's going on when they're allowed access to their phones. And you have an established communication with them about that. And that's, I think my main point is establishing dialogue, creating an environment that allows for conversation about how you're going to use these things. Because ultimately, you have to develop in them an appreciation for how powerful these are. Technology, we're Americans, we like technology. My grandfather loved the radio. There was television. And there's a sense that they're all equivalent. It's just my great-grandfather's Victrola, okay? And that's not the case at all. And it's easy for kids, especially smart, verbal kids, like my kids, smarter than me, to engage me in conversations I can't win and try to explain, well, it's just like the same thing you had. And it really isn't in a lot of important ways. Media type and number of devices. Differentially, it's not surprising. Sometimes you see kids now with their phones going, laptop. They got a phone going, they got a laptop going, they got music coming out, and it's how do you manage all that? So actually, and this is well established, you're better off listening to heavy metal music for 15 to 20 minutes before you go to bed than being on your cell phone or on your laptop. Okay?
That goes for adults too, right?
Yes, especially you. Bob was a headbanger from way back. Okay, disrupted sleep. What are the consequences? increasing internalizing and externalizing behavior. It's psychobabble for internalizing behaviors, things like anxiety and depression. Externalizing behaviors, things like impulsivity, aggressive behaviors, difficulty self-regulating. And that's really what we're talking about here, is the implications for these devices on the development of your own inertial guidance system. Okay, the things that allow you to stop, listen, look at alternatives, generate alternatives, monitor what you're doing. People talk about these as executive functions. And developing executive functions is a big business. But that's what we're talking about in terms of how deregulating or dysregulating some of these media can be for kids at a time when we're trying to get them to slow down and develop some behaviors that are going to help them adapt and change their behavior in the world around them. So the other part of this is that on fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, like MRI, looking at glucose metabolism, they have identified some structural changes in the brain in kids who, and this are usually teenagers, I'm not talking about tweens, but kids who are using media, and so that's glomming a lot of different things in together, but are using media over 10 hours a day. Okay, and that's fairly easy to do. If you have a phone, you're on your computer all the time, there's really oftentimes there's no interval when kids are not either checking their phone or on, doing work. Okay, the key thing here, these are neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are important. The production of neurotransmitters is important, especially in the adolescent brain. And this is dopamine and its cousins, norepinephrine and epinephrine. And they're really important. They function in different ways. Dopamine is what you don't have enough of if you have ADHD. It's what you don't have enough of in Parkinson's, okay? And you have sometimes often too much of it in people who have schizophrenia. But it's important because it is crucial in terms of developing reward behavior, all right? Learning, and it affects, these are the different pathways. Mesocortical pathway is a nigrostriatal one, and the mesolimbic pathway. And this is the one that's sort of the most important because it involves pleasure and reward, reward-seeking behaviors, addiction, emotion, ties into the limbic system, for those of you who took some psychology in college. And this is what the platforms are targeting. So the goal of Facebook, the goal of Snapchat is to keep you on the platform. And because to keep you on the platform means you're going to be interacting, buying, exposed to advertising potentially. And this is something that is absolutely targeted, and it's particularly difficult because kids are, they're going through a period of change where they're more plastic. Their brains are developing. Plasticity is an important notion in brain development. Brains are changing, and they're changing during sleep. There's a period of time where pruning's going on in adolescence, where you're starting to have some thinning out neurally, and also white matter connections in the brain, not the cortex, not the gray stuff, but deeper in the brain. White matter myelin sheath is being developed. And there are some studies to suggest that kids who have disrupted sleep, that process is going on a little bit differently. So Remember B.F. Skinner? He put his daughter in a box, if you remember that, Skinner box. He's a graduate of my alma mater. People don't talk about him much anymore. But one of the things that he understood was variable reward. The most powerful way to shape behavior is not is when the reward is hard to predict. Okay, because that keeps people anticipating. It keeps them hooked in. So there are algorithms on the platforms for Facebook, on Instagram, that know that. They know that they want to keep you there. Did they like it? How many likes did I get? I just selfied myself. Who's liking it? Okay? I know, it's hard to imagine. Don't imagine it. Okay? But it keeps you on the edge of your seat, and that's built in. And it's an intersection, it's sort of a perfect storm between neurodevelopment and commercial application of this device, or these devices. And kids are absolutely, they're absolutely, they want to be liked. It's nice to be liked. It's nice to have people give you thumbs up. It's also nice to make sure that no one's talking trash about you. And I'll just share this because I have my time up yet?
Right here.
Is it?
Oh.
Thanks. Oh, thanks. So I'm a middle school psychologist. I'm supposedly good with kids. I have a couple, and they're fairly well adjusted. And my son, I was beaten down, and I finally allowed him to get an iPhone. And pretty soon his reading declined, and his iPhone use increased. And I felt like I had been scammed. And it kept going on, and despite the better angels of my nature, one time I just said, could you put the damn thing away? I was watching sports, and I found that really insulting that he was not paying attention to a game. And I said, what are you doing? What are you doing? And he said, I'm checking. I said, what are you checking? I'm checking to make sure no one is saying bad stuff about me. And I thought that was just sort of like a shot right through my heart. I mean, he's worried that someone is going to be talking about him online. And I thought, like, it never even occurred to me, that was an additional thing that he now had to monitor. And he was on alert for that, okay? That's a level of arousal, okay? That's a level of arousal and fear that comes along with this. And I think that's important to understand, too, that it's not just that you want to be friends and get likes and all that. It's you have to be careful what's out there. And, I think that's upsetting, certainly for parents, especially when you find out that, people aren't saying tough things about your kid. So laughing faces, positive recognition by our peers. The like on Instagram is really important. Selfies, that's another thing. I mean, it's hard to understand. Everything's an event. Everything. And there's some other, we'll talk about this later, but this is really important. And the best predictor, okay, is parent screen time. What you're doing with your phone is the best predictor of what your kids are going to be doing with it. If they see you breaking, you watch, when you greet them after a day, hi, honey. I love you too. Okay? That's a break. That's a break. 10, 20 of those don't matter. A pattern of those matter. Okay? So.
Good stuff.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Todd. So as we move from the first part of our discussion into talking about some strategies for limit setting and finding the right fit for your family, just wanted to move on to give you a quick screenshot of the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations for screen time in children of different ages. And as people are looking at this and seeing this, I just wanted to see a show of hands. Who has seen this information before or knows this information already? Okay. So I'm looking, that looks to me to be about a quarter of the audience was already familiar with these. And so that's just interesting, right? As a parent of a young child, I wasn't completely familiar with these until I saw them for this presentation. I thought that was interesting. All right, so when you're thinking about what might be a good fit for your family and you're thinking about limit setting, one way to lay a foundation, right, is to check in with what the experts are saying, like the AAP. Some other reputable resources are Common Sense Media. They have a lot of data and a lot of really good information on their website. Another one that we find parents going to and that we use a lot in our work is by the filmmaker Dr. Rustin, who did Screenagers. Have people seen that? So some people have. She has a website and a blog that's attached to that website and has some good data and some good recommendation on there as well. So thinking about what the experts say, that's going to help inform where you land. Also thinking about what are other children and families doing. So that same Common Sense Media, they do regular census reports and lots of surveys. So you can go on there and see some of the same information you saw in Todd's slides. You can see, you can go in by age group and see what parents are saying about the limits that they set, what's challenging for parents, how much screen time are kids those ages actually getting with these reports. And then Screenagers blog submissions and comments are a great resource. A favorite one in our office, we actually had posted it through our social media, was they asked people to just write in with the summertime screen limits that they were instituting in their household. And it was really cool to go through and see the wide range of limit setting that was happening. So some people, the kids had to get 10,000 steps in on their Fitbits before they could access screen time. Other families you had to do a certain amount of academic work, you had to do a certain amount of chores before you could access screen time. Still other families you had to have in-person contact, with members of the family or outside the household before you could access screen time. And then still others didn't have a threshold or something you had to do in order to get your screen time. They maybe just had limits like 1 hour or on Saturdays and Sundays for 2 hours. So a really wide range, but really nice to see. And they listed the ages and the number of kids in the household. So that was helpful as well. And of course, talking with other families, seeing what's going on out there. I think a third important part is thinking about what are the preferences and styles of your family. So I thought this was interesting. This was on one of the things that I was reading, and the parent said, the two major values in our household are creativity and compassion. And I think all the time about how technology can support those and how technology can detract from those or threaten those values that we have in our household. And that informed the limits that they had and the conversations they were having. And I thought that was really wise to be thinking about how can technology support or threaten the values that are important to you as a family. And then thinking about strengths and challenges. So I always go back to, as a counselor working with young kids and families, like sticker charts, right, and reward systems and all that kind of stuff. We recommend things like that in a lot of situations, and that's great. But some families, have said, we're just not going to do that sticker chart. It's just not going to happen. And it's good to be, knowing that about yourself. What kinds of limits have worked for you in the past? What kind of systems have you put in place that were moderately or maybe majorly successful? And what ones have kind of crashed and burned? Not that you shouldn't, try new things or go back and try something that hasn't worked in the past, but just the idea that just like every person, every family has certain tools and strategies that have worked well for them. And could you take those and use them when it comes to screen time and technology? Also thinking about what would that balance look like in your household. So again, just like that summertime screen limit thing, some people think about, imagine all of these things being balanced. Some people really think about physical activity being balanced with online activity or, screen time. Some people think about in-person social time and how that's balanced with screen time. Or you might have multiple things and you're thinking about how do all of these balance out together and what do I think that would look like in my household? starting and maintaining the conversation. So this was really interesting. I was thinking about, this, and I've heard other people talk about this too, the idea of, when do I start talking to children? At what age do we start having this conversation? And I really think that technology has become a lifelong relationship for children. From birth till forever, technology will be a part of their lives. And for many of us in the room, that wasn't the case. This is the kind of new reality. And so just like other lifelong relationships, like a child's relationship to their body, or a child's relationship to nutrition and diet, their relationship to technology is something that you can start talking about, and maybe you should start talking about as soon as possible and over the course of their lifetime. An ongoing, regular, calm, and consistent conversation. I was thinking, with kids, it's just natural. We think, of course, we're going to help them identify the different parts of their body, right? And think about the things that their bodies can do, and being careful with their bodies, and being respectful of other people's bodies. And then that evolves into a discussion about privacy in their bodies, and that goes on to talk about the changes in their bodies. And when we're talking about puberty, and you go on to talk about how substances might impact their body or their brain. And it's just this ongoing conversation you're having with your child about their relationship with their body. And we do the same thing around nutrition, and I think that what we know is that technology is there in the same way now. And so thinking about how to have that conversation about technology in age-appropriate ways all across the lifespan, and just making it one other thing that you talk about. Just like those body discussions and the nutrition discussions, the earlier you have them and the more consistently you have them, they just become routine. So that when you have an issue, when an issue arises, it's not such a breaks moment. It's not such a big deal to have a conversation about what's not going well, because you've been talking about this forever. And you've been talking about what's been going well, and you've been talking about what's not been going well. So it really helps to make it a more easily approachable discussion. Some conversation starters, if you're just thinking about broaching this subject of technology and screen time and then getting into limits, things like, hey, what's positive versus negative about technology? What are all the positive things that technology and screens bring into our lives? And really starting off on this positive note, we all can think of things that we like. And kids especially, I think, appreciate the acknowledgement that there's a lot of good stuff that comes with technology. And then balancing that with, okay, and what is challenging about it? What is a negative? Also thinking about, for our family, what are we really good at when it comes to screen time? Oh, well, we're really good about not having it at the table at dinner time. Nobody, is on their screens at dinner time. All right, what is challenging for our family? What do we have a hard time with? Well, when it's time to get off of a video game, it's really hard. Right. So you're just having these conversations about where you are as a family, asking everybody in the family, what would a balanced screen time look like in our house? What would a healthy social media diet look like in our house? Things like that. And so other things about having these conversations, some pointers, and these are for conversations in general, but also work for technology. So making sure that these conversations happen over time in calm and positive settings. So a lot of people have these conversations when there's been an issue and when they're in the middle of an altercation. And so they don't get to have the kind of nice back and forth, positives versus negatives. It turns into something else because everybody is up here emotionally when they're having the conversations. Age-appropriate language and concepts is helpful, and that's challenging, especially if you have multiple children at different ages and stages in your life and in your household. So something that someone told me a long time ago, which has been really helpful, was that idea of just asking first, what do they already know? What do you already know about the internet to a young child? The answer that they give you is going to inform where you start having a conversation with them, because you're going to now know, oh, okay, that's their baseline. This is what they already know or what they think they know. And you can start there. And you can do that, what do you already know about screen time, limits? What do you already know about social media? What do you already know about Snapchat? I just want to see what you know, and then let's have a conversation about it. So that keeps it from being over their head or, kind of at a lower level than what the lower level because you get the instant eye roll, when you try to say something and you get the eye roll. So another thing that can be helpful in these conversations is to have the children in the room go first. So it's normal, I think, sometimes for the kind of I don't know, or for a parent to just jump in and kind of say, well, here's what I think, and here's what I think our family should be doing to solve this issue, or these are the limits I think we should have. But if you're starting with the youngest person in the room, or you're starting with the children in the room, you're going to get more buy-in. Just that same way where if you're starting off with, hey, what do we like about this? What's positive about this? You're going to get more buy-in. If they have a chance to share their ideas, whether it's just ideas about technology, whether it's about ideas for limits, or ideas about problem solving a situation, you're going to have more buy-in. And then when you're brainstorming, so we talk a lot, come on in. We talk a lot about brainstorming, and the idea, kids are very familiar with this, even in kindergarten. We go to classrooms and they know about brainstorming. And the thing with a brainstorm is that anything goes. So if you're brainstorming, whether it's ideas, you're brainstorming limits that you're going to have in your household around screen time, or maybe you're brainstorming solutions to a problem that you're having with screen time or technology. The idea is you can start off with a brainstorm and just say, no idea is a bad idea. Let's get it all down. And so that might look like kids saying, I think there should be no limits on our screen time. And parents saying, I don't think we should have screens in our house anymore, right? And so you can have these kind of extreme ideas and everything in between, and you can get them all down. And then you can go through and say, well, this one isn't palatable to the adults in the room. And kids can say, well, not having any screens isn't going to work. And you can narrow down and see, is there anything on this list that we're willing to try out and experiment and see if it works? And it's just an ongoing, we're trying and seeing if this works. And things can be modified over time. If you want to get a little more formal with this idea of calm, consistent, kind of regular conversation, that same Dr. Rustin of Screenagers, she recommended Tech Talk Tuesdays, and actually has a blog by that name. So the idea is that what she does in her household is every Tuesday they have a discussion at the dinner table about technology. And thankfully, because she has a blog and she has a website, if you join, she will email you those questions and those conversation starters every week. So you can use her ideas as the ones that you're bringing to your family to talk about, or you can just use them to kind of get you going or to supplement what you're already thinking. But that's a more formal idea of having a weekly technology meeting in your house. And she gives some form to that, starting off this way, kind of doing the questions this way. So there's some good form to those conversations that she lends on her blog. All right, so the last part I wanted to talk about. Oh, time? All right. I should have known that about myself already, right? So I'll be quick on this. So there are family agreements and contracts. If you look in your packet, that first one, Common Sense Media Agreements, they have different ones for kids of different ages. It's also available on their website, so you guys can take a look at that. Screenagers has a more narrative version. And then the picture it was just a comment that, this could be as simple as pictures or drawings that young kids or kids who are more visual create. It doesn't have to be a written formal contract. It could be a sign at the kitchen table that says no screens, or a drawing about that. So the idea of coming up with a formal agreement can take a lot of different forms. I'll end there. Thank you.
We're going to have time at the end for questions, everyone, so I just want to make sure everyone knows that. Yep. And before we move on to Dr. Tannenbaum, I just wanted to actually just point out a couple quick things. We're talking, for those of you that kind of joined us at different times, we're talking about screen time. And I think it's really important to note that when we talk about screen time, we're talking about all different screens. So we're talking about the iPhone, we're talking about the iPad, we're talking about the computer, talking about video game consoles, TVs. Back when I was young, screen time meant one thing, and that was watching TV. And now it means lots of things. Kids have access to screens in lots of different ways, and sometimes you take away one and they find a way around and find another. I don't know how many parents have experienced that. I know I certainly have. So when we're thinking about those American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines, and you're looking at those numbers of recommended hours, you really have to add up all those screens, right? And then you think about, well, what do we do with that also when they're using iPads all day in school? Does that count? Doesn't it count? So there's a lot of questions there. I'm going to let move into Sarah. I know that I might be also saying that I'm hoping we can get to at some point. No one's really talked about the issue of video games specifically. We might get to that, specifically violent video games. Does the word Fortnite mean anything to anyone? So maybe we'll get to that in some questions at the end. But let's turn it over to Sarah.
So I just love to start by seeing a show of hands of who has had a fight with their child about screen time. Yeah, awesome. So that's not awesome that you've had it, but that's pretty much what I expected. And you know, sorry.
I forgot about that.
So I came to this honestly because I really never thought I would be doing a talk about screen time. And then you would not believe the number of parents and kids who walk into my office, problems with anxiety, with depression, behavior problems. I run a camp for kids with ADHD. And the pervasive topic is we're having really big arguments around screen time. Right? So this kind of got me interested in why is this such a big problem for our kids, and how do we sort of adapt some of the evidence-based strategies that we use to treat clinical disorders at Judge Baker and really make them more screen time relevant. So using sort of what we know about kids, what we know about parents, and applying them for this problem that is increasingly pervasive across the board. So that's really what I'm going to try to talk to you about tonight. And my recommendations are really things that are sort of piggybacking off the work that Danielle is talking about. So these are strategies when you've tried all the awesome preventative strategies and the family planning strategies that Danielle is recommending you try. I absolutely agree that you should totally start there. You should come to me or sort of think about my strategies when you're like, none of that is working, and we're getting into constant fights, or what parents often say to me is, I've created a screen time monster and I've lost control over my household and my child. I don't even know who they are anymore because they're like, yep, hi mom, sort of always in the screen. And so some really, we like to really give sort of concrete strategies so that you can leave here today thinking about what could I actually go home and start to try right now. And so the first one is something called Grandma's Law, or in sort of clinical jargon, it's called the Premack Principle. And this is something that I'm sure all of you are already familiar with. It's sort of you get dessert after you eat your vegetables, right? If you eat your vegetables, you get dessert. And we really want to sort of think about that with screen time as well, because screen time is a privilege that you provide to your children. You're going to work, you're doing a lot of resources, putting a lot of resources together to afford that iPhone and the iPad and the TV and all the different devices that Bob and Todd and Danielle were talking about. So, you really want to, the first step of sort of taking the power back around these screens is empowering yourself to know I am providing my child with something that is privileged. And really saying, you know what, that is a really important tool because they're super, super motivated by this screen time, right? Their brains are actually wired to want this screen time. So I can kind of use that to get some of the things that I need done throughout the day as well. So a real good example is once you've done your schoolwork, then you can have some screen time. Right? But kids are sort of master negotiators, especially with their parents, right? They kind of know, like, what's that limit I can push? What's that button? What are mom or dad going to give into? Or mom's going to say no, but dad's going to say yes. Or if mom looks super tired, that's when I can totally get more out of her, right? So we really want to kind of set clear and consistent expectations around what those limits are. Because if you say, if you do your homework, then you can get screen time, that's a little vague. Right? So what does that mean? Well, does that mean I can get, sometime on the computer, sometime on the TV, sometimes on the phone? You really want to concretize and operationalize what that is. So maybe it's if you do 30 minutes of schoolwork, then you can have 15 minutes of screen time. Right? And I'm not saying that there's a perfect number. This is really going to be sort of dependent on your kid, their developmental stage, sort of what they're dealing with. But you definitely want to have those sort of rules spelled out, probably written out, so that when when it comes to that time, you can really say, nope, that this is what we agreed to. This is what I'm willing to sort of give you tonight. So there's no negotiation. But what about this? Because then where do you end up? You end up, now they've been on screens for 2 hours. And sometimes, frankly, it's just easier to allow your kid to be on screens, right? You've had a long day, you're like cooking dinner, the two kids are fighting, and you're like, yep, just take the screens, and then, I can get some peace and quiet. But then we often find ourselves in this pickle where now it's like, oh man, I can't get them off the screens, dinner's ready, and no one's coming to the table, or they're coming to the table with 5 devices sort of connected to them. So you want to be really, really clear, and you want to be consistent. If you give in, if you say, okay, just this one time you can eat with your iPad at the table, that's going to start to set the standard that maybe I can get my parent to sort of, accommodate that request, or sort of, I can start to negotiate on a more regular basis about working with some of those limits. So again, you really want to be specific about the good behaviors that result in screen time, and I'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. But if you behave well, that's very confusing. Danielle, Todd, Bob, and I probably all have different definitions of what behaving well is. And you want, if your kids are motivated by that screen time, you want them to know exactly what they need to do in order to earn that screen time. So it's very clear across the board. You're clear on the screen time limits. They're clear on the behavior that's requisite in order to get that screen time. Okay? Okay. So some of the ways to do this, and I'll show you an example that I use sort of clinically in a slide or two. But you want to sort of think about making a menu. Okay, so a list of chores or responsibilities that your child, is expected to participate in, and then what they can trade in for in terms of screen time, but also other things like hanging out with friends or doing more active activities. So screen time is not the only reward that you're providing your child with, and then you're expanding sort of the repertoire of things that they sort of trade in for each day. You also want to make sure that before you work on this with your child, you are sort of involving any other caregivers, babysitters, spouses, grandparents, anyone who would be working with your child, because you definitely don't want to have a whole system set up and then grandma comes to watch the kids for the weekend and you're like, oh my gosh, they spent 16 hours on screens and I've gone like 3 weeks back. So you want to make sure that everyone is sort of participating and really on board so that you can stick to it, right? Follow through is so important with kids. I'm sure you all know that already, but really if you give an inch, it results in a mile, right? So you want to make sure everyone is on board. And you can structure this in really simple ways. Maybe you say, in our house we have no more than 1 hour of screen time per day, and it's got to be used by 8 p.m. So if your child has a 9 o'clock bedtime, their brain can start to shut down and sort of get them into that restorative sleep that Todd was talking about that's so important for their healthy and adaptive functioning. You also, to Bob's point, want to be really specific about what the sites or modalities are that are appropriate for your kid, right? So maybe you don't want them being on Instagram or Musical.ly for 15 minutes, for more than 15 minutes a day, but there's other websites or there's research or YouTube that you feel more comfortable with. But you really want to be monitoring what your kids are doing and knowing what they're doing so that you can make sure they're doing it in a safe and appropriate way. And then you're really going to be informed about how to set limits on those different modalities. I guess one other point that is just really important to this is a lot of times when I work with parents, they're really scared to set limits around some of these things, or feel like, but all the other parents are letting them do this, or then my kid's gonna, just think I'm the worst. And it can be super scary to set limits with kids, and they often bump up against those limits. But limit setting is a really, really important way for you as caregivers to demonstrate, I as a parent can keep you safe, right? And even though kids often really don't like the limits sort of in their protestation, either verbal or physical protestation, they do like it because it means that you're monitoring and you're watching. There's a really unfortunate sort of trend with kids with depressive behaviors sort of posting about suicidal thoughts or suicidal actions online. A lot of times we think, wow, that's really sort of attention seeking, and look who it's projecting to, right? Other kids might be seeing it, other parents might be seeing it, and it's really hard as a parent to think, my kid is upstairs in their room and they're talking about feeling really sad or depressed and they haven't come and talked to me, right? Sometimes posting something like that online is a way for the kid to initiate that conversation with their parent, and if they know that you're watching, then, if they post something like that, then they're like, my mom's going to come in and respond to that right away. right? So you really want to have conversations with them about what healthy screen time use is too, because that's not really the kind of thing that you want your kid to be like posting or sharing online. That's really something, that should be discussed more with, a therapist or a parent or someone who can be supportive. Okay, so I'm going to use sort of an amalgamation of kids that I have worked with to give a little example of how we do this work. So this is a 14-year-old boy named Joel, and he had some pretty significant anxiety around social skill interaction. It was really hard for him to play with peers, to make new friends. He kind of didn't know like what to say, or if what he was saying was like weird or kind of awkward. So he really had a hard time socially. And he spent about 6 hours a day on different screen devices. His dad actually worked at Google and still had a really hard time setting appropriate limits with him. And he actually had a pretty significant online community of friends through different social media sites like Fortnite, like video games, where he sort of had this thing that we call the disinhibition effect. It's sort of, because you're on screens, you can become like a different person, right? He can be brave. He knows how to talk to people. There's sort of this common language. And that's not in and of itself a bad thing. It's just that we really want to help kids figure out how to use that sort of facilitation socially to move it into more real world realms, so that kids can start to engage more socially. So I don't think the online engagement is necessarily bad in and of itself. It's just that it should be a sort of stepwise tool to get that more face-to-face conversation. We'll take questions just at the end. So he was only really communicating with friends through these online communities. His parents said, "We have created an addict. He is addicted to screens. We don't know what to do." And he actually, he was sort of at the end of the age range that we're talking about tonight. And I'm using this example to sort of think about preventing some of these big behaviors, because Joel got very aggressive, both physically and verbally, when his parents tried to set limits around screen time. So things like knocking shelves over, sort of posturing to his mom, who was smaller than him at the time he turned 14, refusing to do things. So they really felt stuck, because they felt like if we put limits around Joel, he's going to respond in these really, really big ways. So what do you think I did? Just say, I'm done, I can't handle this. Oh my gosh, you're beyond my skills. Start to set limits. Yeah. So the first way that we start to set limits, I actually didn't even encourage mom and dad to reduce that 6 hours of screen time. Even though that seems like a lot, even though it felt really problematic for them, the first step that I did with them was just start to think about setting up a contingency around screen time. So it was really, really easy for him to earn his 6 hours of screen time, but he had to start earning it, just to get that concept sort of ingrained in his brain that this is not just a right that he has to be on screens, but that it's contingent on some sort of behavior. Okay? So this is an example of some of the responsibilities that Joel was expected for. And you can see in the sort of parentheses, there are different point values that are associated with each task. And they're really in sort of a easy, medium, and hard value list. I know it's a little hard to see, and this is really dependent on Joel. So, you might think taking out the trash or completing a trash checklist seems really easy. For him, it was really hard, so that's how we sort of determined the point value. But there are things on here that are super simple. He's a 14-year-old boy, brush your teeth 1 time a day. We're meeting the kid where he's at and just setting some expectations about where he is. This is not where mom and dad wanted him to end up, so we have to sort of, create this chart and then continually modify it when his behavior improves. This is something that we call shaping. Okay? So this is what was expected of Joel, sort of the chores and responsibilities. You can see they're really clearly defined for him. And then this is the rewards menu. And here's that 1 hour of screen time, okay, must be used by 10 p.m. for him. It's only 1 point. All the other things on here are a lot, many, many more points, because it was a way to show Joel you can still earn the amount of screen time that you're currently getting. We're not taking it away. It's not a huge fight. We just have some of these expectations that go hand in hand. Okay? His reward chart looked really different after a few months of treatment. right? It looked more sort of what mom and dad wanted it to look like, more sort of what a typical kid should probably be doing. But this is how we started. And I'm using this extreme example, again, to sort of encourage you to address this problem early and intensely enough for your child. And also to see that, you know, there are totally ways, no matter how extreme the behaviors are or how out of control you might feel that it's gotten, that you can set these limits and be really, really effective in sort of cutting down your kids' screen time behavior and getting them to do other things like play an electric guitar, go out to a comedy show, because we want kids to be doing things not just on screens. Okay? So one of the really big things that I just want to, make sure that you hear from us today is that if you're having this struggle, if it's more than a passing struggle, if you're like ripping your hair out, if every night it's a fight, do not worry about this stuff alone, because there's a ton of resources out there that can help, and we see this problem all the time, so there is no shame or judgment in seeking supports for your child. And there are some really good evidence-based treatments that we recommend that can really help in a very concrete and structured short-term way to get things back on track for you and your family. And I encourage you to be thinking about this, even if you're like, whoa, that's not me and my family will never get there. Think about it early and often, because you don't want to wait until Joel is destroying your house and you feel like you've totally lost it to start to work on some of these problems. And just remember that kids, you know, even though they don't like those limits, deep down inside, it's really helpful for them to know that you can keep them safe and you understand what's going on with them.
Well, thank you to our panel. We now have the opportunity for some questions. I know someone had a question over here. So let's start with the young gentleman in the aisle.
Do you realize that treating screen time like it's a reward will create a bad habit? Once that reward's gone, you're probably not going to care for those things.
Did you hear the question?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I think the question was, having the reward system for screen time, they would then not want to do the things that they were doing to earn the screen time once that reward was taken away. Like they wouldn't, yeah.
Yeah. Sarah, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so you know, this is absolutely something that we work on all the time, and that's why I said that, you know, reward charts and responsibility charts are really an iterative process, right? It's not a one and done. So really what we do is we start to make it harder to earn things like screen time, because we want to start to see more challenging behaviors earn the same amount of screen time and then eventually cut it down. Also, with a kid like Joel, because we were able to facilitate more sort of in-person social communication, and he was able to see, you know what, I'm not as bad at this as I thought. And when I practice this, you know, I'm getting some really positive reinforcement from my peers, from grown-ups. My parents are super happy. I have play dates. I have sleepovers. Screen time started to be less of a reward because now he had a larger array of things that were really fun for him, right? So it moved into something that was more sort of naturally and socially reinforcing, and he still chose screen time a lot of the time, but we actually were able to cut it down where during the week he was only on screens for 1 hour a day. And that was a really, it took a little bit of time, it took a lot of work and some tears and fights with mom and dad, but we got there, you know, in about 6 months of treatment. Where he really was able to curtail his screen time. So that's why, you know, I always think about rewards systems and programs sort of like Goldilocks, right? It can't be too easy, it can't be too hard. If it's too easy, a kid's never going to buy into it. If it's too easy, a kid's just going to get sort of all the things. If it's too hard, a kid's never going to buy into it. So there's sort of that middle ground that's really that sweet spot, and that's going to continue to change developmentally and as behaviors improve and are shaped over time.
Do we have any other questions? Yes.
Sure.
What do you recommend when you have kids of different ages? I have a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old. They love being together, but obviously they should have different screen times. And if one earns it and the other doesn't, then it's a problem. Do you have recommendations for that?
You want to take that? Or?
That's a tough one. Look at you looking at me. No,
I'm happy to.
I think I'm happy to start off with that answer. I think that's, and to take other input from other panelists or anyone else. I think that when you have kids of different ages, that the question was, what do you do if you have like 5 and 10 and they want to be together, but they have different screen limit times that are recommended, and what if one earns it and one doesn't? And I think, the probable, hardest answer and best answer would be that you are talking about it individually, right? That you're saying, this is, or that you're going, I guess what I would realistically think what might be happening is going towards the lower end. So if you're setting up kind of screen limits in your home and you're looking at those AAP recommendations and you're thinking, okay, this is what's appropriate for 5 to 9, and then they said 10 to 14, maybe it's just what you're going to go with the 5 to 9, right? So those are recommendations. You can go low. There's not a problem with that, right? And then I think another way of handling it might be to talk about it as something where if someone earned it and someone didn't, maybe that happened, there's a setup for how that could happen respectfully, right? Maybe if someone earned screen time, you had a way of earning it in your household and the 5-year-old earned it and the 10-year-old didn't. Maybe the screen time then happens in a place away from the other sibling so that it's not right there. Those are the two kind of off the top of my head, but people might have other things to
I
add
think
to that.
one of the things I would say that, this is an ongoing process. This is a conversation and not an event, and it's a lifetime. So you're not going to get to a point where it's all fixed. You're going to be doing battle every day. And I mean that in the best possible way. But kids are smart. They understand that there are differences in age, and they understand that certain privileges come with age. And you do have to be more active in your parenting, and that takes a lot of effort. And I get that. But it's important that the 5-year-old knows that the 10-year-old, whether it's true or not, has earned privileges that come with age, and they get to play a different game on a video console than the 5-year-old does. Whether it's Xbox or whatever. Just the same way that you could watch another television show. But it's not realistic to say everybody sort of gets the same. And one of the things that's happening here is that the capacity to delay gratification is going out the window. And it's a very powerful reinforcement mechanism that's destroying that. When you look at what are the predictors of success in adulthood, having parents, high socioeconomic background, a good vocabulary, and the ability to delay gratification. Those are the things that predict it. Video games are incredibly powerful because you get feedback immediately. You blow something up, unfortunately, you win. That's dopamine. Boom. I get that. Boom. That's happening all the time. All the time. And it's rigged to happen all the time because you get that's the whole point. A book can't compete with that. There are no 10-year-olds reading poetry because it just doesn't give you the bang. And it's important to understand that too. I mean, when you're looking at Fortnite, you really need to say, you've got 15 minutes of Fortnite. Enjoy it, and then it's over. And then we're going to transition for over an hour before you go to bed. And that transition is critical. It's a time for peace. It's a time where the public world is kept in abeyance till the morning. And, we're just going to stop things and have some quiet. And that's very, very difficult to do. The whole division between the public and the private is now, we have people. I work with younger people who don't understand why I'm not responding to their text messages at 9:30 at night. Because I'm not. Now, you're doing that all the time. And your kids see that. They see that you're doing that. You're working hard. That's the culture that you're in. It means you're a team player. You're a serious person. It also means that you're distracted. And it also means that your kids are seeing that. And you have to, it's important that we take ownership of that. There are things, my mom texts me. I'll pick that up at 11:30 at night. She's 81. My kids will do that? Absolutely. But I'm not conducting work at 9:45 at night. I'm too old for that. I'm in my bed in my jammies, all right? And hopefully my work record speaks for itself. But the point is that kids are very aware. They're seeing that. They're seeing that it's never over. And they're internalizing that. So,
We have
this one.
What kind of advice do you give parents who want to limit, say, probably more for teenagers or older tweens, but we're trying to limit their kids' device use, but then are worried that their kids aren't going to be able to access like academic messages, requirements, like there's a lot of stuff in the curriculum now that's it's electronic, and also are worried that their kids have to like stay plugged in socially. Like so much socializing happens with devices these days, and it's hard for parents not to generalize that fear of the kid might not be able to maintain connections if they're not plugged in. What kind of advice do you give, and knowing that there's no simple answer?
First of all, did everybody hear the question? So make sure everyone heard. Okay, great.
I'm looking at that.
look at me.
So I can chime in. So, I think it's a really important question, and as we're moving into school being completed a lot more online, and Todd, you can probably talk to this too, I really like to differentiate academic screen time use from sort of fun and unstructured screen time use. So I think that's a totally different bucket, and a lot of the rewards and the earning system that I'm talking about are really for that more unstructured free time on screen. So I think that's really a question to ask. If there's a fight with school, or if you want to make sure they're not missing anything, or that they need their computer to complete work, that you're really making sure that the teacher is communicating with you around that. So there's no like sneakiness, like they say they're using it for schoolwork, and then you find they're on YouTube for a couple hours a day. So I think you really just want to get curious with your kid, and make sure that that's kind of a very different bucket. I think the social thing is a lot more challenging because it's the reality of how kids are interacting online. But again, there's a lot of safety risks. There's a lot of more bullying that's happening online. There's a lot of exclusion, or kids feeling left out of things because of things like group selfies or group chats or different things like that. So I think you just kind of want to know how your kid is communicating and get curious with them, and really get a good sense of what it is. If you're putting limits around it, like how are other parents managing this? What are other ways that you can help them facilitate communication that doesn't just have to be through sort of social media or online communities?
I was going to add to that and just say that in your packets there's a list of concrete resources, and on there's things like a link to the instructions where you can actually set time limits on iPhones and iPads. So that's kind of a very concrete, like it would shut down at a certain point when it comes to that. There's also things, Common Sense Media did like a top 5 monitoring apps, right? And the thing that we always say about those is that the best way to do that is in a transparent way, to say this is something that we're going to do that comes along with the privilege and responsibility of having access to this device, is that we're going to be looking at the apps you use. And I believe that there are monitoring applications that allow you to see how much time was spent on different things. So then it becomes a conversation, right? I know that you need to use this for schoolwork, but I also noticed that 2 hours was spent on YouTube in the time where we had agreed that it would be school time, right?
Okay,
So it
now
allows
just
you
to
to
follow up to that. What would you say about passwords? An expectation, should parents know their kids' passwords, and should they be checking their Snapchats and Instagram and Facebook pages?
The short answer is yes, and I think that it's, again, if you have this idea of an ongoing and evolving conversation, yes. And then I was just talking to someone the other day whose child, who was 15, was at a point of kind of changing over an iPhone, and said, I think that I could not give you my password now, but you could just be linked to me. Like, can we try that out? And the parent was like, all right, you know, like we can try that out. So it was an idea that was brought forth by the kid for more privacy and responsibility. And the parent felt comfortable trying it and then said, yeah, we can try it. And then we're going to revisit this, you know, in a couple weeks and see how that's going and how that's feeling for both of us. And we might change it back if we need to.
I want to reiterate something that was brought up earlier, and that is for those of you that are living in two-parent households, it's really important that you talk to your partner or spouse about these issues and be on the same page as much as possible. And I think that's also an ongoing dialogue, because I know, you know, in our household, I have different ideas than my wife about, you know, issues around the boundaries of privacy and how that evolves over time, but we talk about it. And we come to some sort of mutual agreement about that, and we present a united front to our kids.
Yep.
So I think that's a really important piece of it.
I noticed there was an early.
Kind of touched, I have kind of million questions spinning around in my head, but we've touched on a lot of them. I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, it was mostly about monitoring time.
Can I just make a plug for Sherry Turkle? If you've seen her on YouTube, she's a professor at MIT. She's done a lot of really good, interesting research on the impact of technology on college-age kids and adolescents, and how it impacts psychopathology, anxiety, and depression, but also how it impacts the evolution of the sense of self, who we are, and also people's anxiety and your ability to manage your own anxiety when you're not in contact with people you love. So, you know, I'm old enough to have used to call my parents once every Sunday for 10 minutes with like a phone card. And, you know, I do my 10 minutes on the phone. Yep, studying hard. Excellent. Thank you. Send me a check, please. And that was about it, other than my father sending me nice letters. But I had to develop a mental image of my parents and the connection I had with them. And that was really helpful in times when I wasn't with them. And now, and in so doing too, you develop what we call self-representational models, who you are. And you carry those around with you. And those are essential in developing a healthy sense of self. And now, people don't have to do that. They've got pictures all the time. Let me show you this. Let me show you that. Mom's right here. Yep, get right back to you. And that really implicates your ability to grow as a person and to self-regulate and to be independent. And that's what you're looking for. We're in the business of growing children who are independent and healthy. And I think that's one of the reasons too that we have to set limits. That kids or adolescents are really, despite all the blowback you get, they want limits. They need structure. That makes you feel loved and cared about. In the time that I've been doing what I do, I can't tell you the number of kids, whether they were in inner city Boston or from Dover, who would say, I really wish my parents had kicked me in the butt, or something similar to that. And what they meant was, had cared enough to set limits and reel me in. And I think that's part of this, because I do believe this is qualitatively and quantitatively a different sort of situation than in the past.
And just to say something off of that, I think that's the idea of delaying the gratification of being in contact with a loved one, right? I think it goes the other way too. Like, you had the good example of kids monitoring, and the idea of like how much social stuff happens, good or bad, online. And kids will say, have you heard FOMO, like fear of missing out? So kids will talk about that and how that's hard. You know, they feel bad if they see pictures and they weren't there. But if they're not able to access their devices or to get onto social media, they fear that they're going to miss out and either be talked about or going to miss out on a joke, you know, or something that they want to be a part of because their friends and their peers are a part of it. Being able to sit with that fear and to see yourself on the other side of it and to say, okay, I was worried about that. I got through that worry. It was okay on the other side, or I don't have to be in constant, you know, contact online in order for me to have relationships with these people. Those are good, important things that go along with that delay of gratification.
We're going to have to wrap up, or a little over time, but I just wanted to thank our panel. Thank you so much for the information. I know there's a lot more to talk about with this topic. And the one thing I just want everyone to leave here with is just to remember to feel empowered as a parent. You can actually make a difference in your family's life, in your household. You could follow some of these tips and instructions. You could seek out other resources and materials. Starting early is incredibly important. And also sticking to your guns is really important. Sticking to what you believe in. It's not always easy. I know, we had a rule in our house that there were no video games during the school week. They could only play them on weekends. And we also allowed no violent video games in our household. They were only allowed to play sports games. Those weren't popular decisions. They weren't popular with our kids necessarily, and they weren't necessarily popular, with their peers. But over time, they learned how to manage that and negotiate that. And they developed a lot of other interests and skills and did some of the things that the panel suggested. But we had to stick to that through challenges, through pushback. And, that's really what it takes. It's hard to be a parent today. We all work hard. We're all tired. How many times have you seen somebody hand their phone to a baby or to a toddler to amuse them? It happens all the time. Just go to a restaurant. You'll see half the toddlers holding phones. It's very challenging to set these kinds of limits, but we also have to recognize that we live in a world where technology is omnipresent. So how do we, as the panel said, how do we develop that relationship with technology? But you can't give that power away as a parent. You have to take back your role as a parent to say, we're going to set some limits, we're going to set some boundaries, we're going to come to some consensus about how we're going to approach this, so that the technology is not ruling our house and our lives, but that we are actually negotiating what our relationship with technology is and figuring out what role do we want it to play in our lives. Everyone here is a great resource. Todd is here in the Westwood Public Schools as a school psychologist, so he's in your community. Danielle, directs Westwood Youth Services. If you have challenges and concerns and it feels like it's too much, you've got a great person right here in your community. If you have more serious concerns and you really feel like you might need some more intensive intervention or treatment, please give us a call at Judge Baker and we can help you. Also, as I said, we're bringing our therapeutic camp for kids with ADHD here to Hale, so if you have kids who you think might benefit from that, let us know. I will say all their contact information is up here. Someone pointed out to me that Sarah's number is actually 4252. The 4 is actually inaccurate, so if you needed to reach her, that's actually a 2 on the end. I'm sorry we're out of time, but I appreciate your attention and thank you so much. And thank you to our panel.